Hello, my friend. A few words about Shakespeare on evil, which you will find quite similar to Dostoevsky, because authors of novels or plays do not create a kind of treatise on evil. They do not create a whole philosophical system. Instead, they explore the psychological and social phenomenon or experience of what evil people do in the world. So for Shakespeare, this is famously true. He doesn't look at evil as a force, but as something that is born through an individual human being. And it is born especially of destructive emotions, such as ambition and jealousy. And he shows these up as the root of evil as it comes to be played out quite literally in the drama of an individual in one of his plays. So I'll just give you some examples of that. In his tragedies particularly, evil is often represented by a person who is gradually corrupted in their self. So this was quite revolutionary, because up to then in plays there had been sort of morality characters. So there were specific sorts of characters representing different vices. And what Shakespeare did uniquely was to bring these various elements together in a complex human character to study how a person ends up leaning into evil and choosing evil. And this is very interesting, because clearly they don't deliberately choose to be evil, but it is by allowing themselves not to challenge themselves to be good that they take the path of least resistance and end up collapsing into evil, if you like, sliding into evil. Macbeth, for instance, is a good example of that, which begins with the seed of his ambition being planted by external forces in the shape of the witches, who give him this idea, but that idea is then nurtured by Macbeth's own will. And the whole play is about showing the destructive power of that evil. The more Macbeth kills to secure his power and influence, and the more he loses his sanity and his humanity. And this is true also in Othello, with Iago, who is a sort of representation of malignancy, of motiveless evil. He represents the pure, cold, intellectually calculating evil of someone who destroys others simply because he can, or because he resents the daily beauty in somebody else's or other people's lives. So that is an observation of what actually happens to people who foster this negativity in themselves, or rather as part of their lives, and who allow it to gain power over them. So there are often kind of cosmic consequences of this. So in Shakespeare you often see storms or disasters happening alongside betrayals or difficulties for instance, when King Lear is betrayed by his daughter. But the onus ultimately is seen as something that happens through social circumstances, but is fed by the villain of the piece, and the villain is a human production. So some very famous characters you will recognize: Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, whose desire for a pound of flesh is portrayed as a monstrous response to years of systemic abuse and dehumanization. So there is no excuse for having been abused and dehumanized. You still have to take responsibility for what you do with what is being done to you, and when you don't, you become the embodiment of evil. Same for Richard III, determined to prove a villain, although he's deformed and unfit. So evil is a reaction to a world that has rejected the individual first, but the individual doesn't rise to that challenge, but allows himself to drift into vengefulness and ends up the embodiment of evil. So this is a good way to expose the complexity of evil. It isn't that you are born good or evil, and it isn't because you have suffered that you can't be evil. You can become evil if you allow yourself to not reflect on how you live, and you take the path of least resistance, following your emotions and your blind sense of having a right to vengeance when nobody ever really has that right, and all of us continuously have to ask ourselves what is right and what is wrong. There is no special pleading, no excuses, and when you give up on that responsibility, your life becomes a human tragedy. Shakespeare's contribution is very valuable to this day.